The doors of the council hall slammed shut before Elena could take a single step back. She had not been told why she was summoned. She had not been told that her own father would stand at the head of the long stone table and refuse to look at her. She had not been told that the men from the Blackthorn pack were already waiting near the far wall, arms crossed, eyes moving over her like she was livestock brought in for auction. "You will go with them," her father said. His voice did not shake. That was the part that hurt the most. He had rehearsed this. He had known for days, maybe weeks, and he had said nothing to her. "Go where?" Elena asked. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "The Alder pack owes a debt," said the old advisor standing beside her father. "The Blackthorn pack has agreed to forgive it. In exchange, you will serve them." Serve them. The words sat strange in her chest, too small for what she understood them to mean. She looked at the men across the room. One of them, tall and broad-shouldered, with a scar running from his jaw to his collarbone, was already studying her the way a buyer studies a horse before deciding on a price. "You are selling me," she said. No one answered. No one needed to. Her mother was not in the room. Elena noticed that first, and it told her everything about how this had been arranged. Her mother would have fought. Her mother would have stood between her and the door. So they had made sure her mother was somewhere else. "This is not a punishment," her father said, finally meeting her eyes. "This is survival. The pack cannot pay what it owes. If we do not send someone, the Blackthorn pack will take the land, the hunting grounds, everything. You are the only unmarried daughter of rank. It has to be you." Elena felt the floor of her world tilt beneath her feet. She had grown up believing her father loved her the way any father loves a child born of his own blood. She had believed that love meant something more than convenience, more than usefulness. She understood now, standing in that cold stone hall, that she had been wrong. "How long?" she asked. "There is no set time," the advisor said. "You belong to them now, until the debt is considered paid in full, at their discretion." At their discretion. She looked again at the scarred man by the wall. He smiled at her, and it was not a kind smile. It was the smile of someone who already knew he had won something. "My name is Garrick Thorne," he said, stepping forward. "Alpha of the Blackthorn pack. You will find that we do not tolerate weakness where you are going, girl. I suggest you learn quickly." Elena did not answer him. She looked instead at her father, waiting for some flicker of regret, some sign that this was tearing him apart the way it was tearing her apart. She found nothing. He had already made peace with what he was doing. He had made peace with it before she ever walked into the room. "Take her belongings to the wagon," Garrick said to the man beside him. "We leave before sundown." Elena was given no time to say goodbye to the home she had known her whole life. She was given no time to find her mother, to explain, to be held one last time by someone who actually cared whether she lived or died. She was walked out of the council hall by two Blackthorn warriors, one on each side, as though she might run. She thought about running. She thought about it with every step across the courtyard, every step past the training grounds where she had learned to fight as a child, every step past the old oak tree where she used to sit and dream about a future that had nothing to do with any of this. But running would only bring shame on what remained of her family, and some small, foolish part of her still cared about that, even now. The wagon was plain and hard-benched, built for hauling grain, not people. Elena sat in the back with her one bag of belongings pressed against her chest, and she watched the only home she had ever known shrink into the distance until the trees swallowed it whole. No one spoke to her during the ride. The warriors who guarded her spoke to each other in low voices, laughing sometimes at jokes she was not meant to hear, and Elena kept her eyes on the passing land, trying to memorize the shape of the hills, the color of the sky, anything that still felt like it belonged to the world she had lost. By the time the wagon crossed into Blackthorn territory, the sun had gone from gold to a deep, bruised orange, and the land itself seemed to change. The trees grew closer together here, their branches knotted and dark. The air smelled different, sharper, like something was always on the edge of turning cold. Elena pulled her cloak tighter around her shoulders, though she was certain the chill she felt had little to do with the weather. They reached the Blackthorn compound as the last light faded. It was nothing like her home, where the alder pack had built with warmth in mind, wide windows and open courtyards. The Blackthorn compound rose in sharp gray stone, its walls high, its gates heavy and iron-bound. Torches burned along the walls, casting long shadows that moved like living things. Garrick led the way inside without waiting to see if she followed. Elena had no choice but to keep pace, flanked by the same two warriors, through a maze of corridors that seemed built to disorient anyone who did not already know their way. Finally, they stopped in front of a small door at the end of a narrow hall. "This is where you will stay," Garrick said. "You will report to the kitchens at first light. You will do as you are told, when you are told, without complaint. If you cause trouble, you will regret it. Do you understand?" Elena lifted her chin. Whatever had been taken from her today, she still had this much left, the refusal to let him see her break. "I understand," she said. Garrick studied her for a long moment, as if her steadiness surprised him, or perhaps annoyed him. Then he turned and walked away without another word, and the two warriors left with him, leaving her alone in front of the small door. Inside, the room was bare. A narrow bed, a single shelf, a window too small to climb through, even if she had wanted to try. Elena set her bag down on the floor and sat on the edge of the bed, and for the first time since the council hall, she let herself feel the full weight of what had happened. She did not cry. She told herself she would not give this place her tears, not on the first night, not when there were people close enough to hear. Instead, she sat very still, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of a pack she did not know, in a home that was not her home, and she tried to imagine what tomorrow would look like. She did not know, as she finally lay down and closed her eyes. That far to the north, in a territory ruled by a king, whose name was spoken with both reverence and fear, something had shifted. A man who had not felt anything close to hope in longer than he could remember had woken that same evening, with a strange, unshakable certainty settling over him, the kind of feeling that arrives without explanation and refuses to leave. He did not know her name. He did not know where she was, or what had just been done to her, but somewhere deep in the part of him that had never stopped searching, something had changed. Elena slept without dreams that night, exhausted past the point of feeling anything at all. She woke before dawn, to the sound of someone pounding on her door, telling her the kitchens did not wait for anyone, and she rose to begin her first day in a life she had never chosen, in a place that had already decided she was worth nothing more than the debt she had come to settle. She would learn, in the days that followed, exactly how wrong that was. Morning came too quickly. Elena had barely closed her eyes when the pounding on her door began again, sharp and impatient, and a voice she did not recognize told her to be dressed and in the kitchens before the bell rang, or she would go without breakfast for a week. She rose stiffly, every muscle protesting the hard bed and the harder night, and pulled on the plain gray dress that had been left folded on the shelf, the uniform of a servant who had never asked to serve. The compound looked different in daylight, though no less foreboding. Stone walls that had seemed merely tall the night before now towered over the courtyard, blocking most of the morning sun, so that the yard remained in shadow long after the sky above had turned bright. Elena crossed it quickly, following the sound of clattering pots toward the kitchens, aware of eyes following her from doorways and windows, servants and warriors alike pausing to study the girl who had been traded in to settle a debt. She caught fragments of whispered conversation as she passed. Someone said her name, though she had not yet told anyone what it was, which meant word had already spread ahead of her. Someone else laughed, low and unkind, and Elena kept her eyes forward, refusing to give either the satisfaction of a reaction. By the time she reached the kitchens, she understood that survival here would require a kind of armor she had never needed to build before. At home, whatever its faults, she had been someone, a daughter, however undervalued in the end. Here, she was simply a name attached to a debt, and everyone within these walls seemed to know it. The first days blurred together in a haze of exhaustion. She learned the layout of the compound not through any kindness offered to her, but through necessity, through trial, and the sharp correction of anyone who found her lost or slow. She learned which halls led to the training yards, which led to the Great Hall, which corridors were forbidden to servants entirely, their doors watched by guards who made clear, without needing words, what would happen to anyone who tried to pass without permission. She thought often, in those first days, of her mother, wondering whether she had been told the truth of what happened, or whether her father had constructed some gentler version of events, to spare himself the accusation in her eyes. She thought of her younger brother, barely old enough to understand what a debt even meant, and hoped he had not been told enough to carry the weight of it. She did not allow herself to think, for long, about what might happen if the debt was never considered paid, about what discretion, in Garrick Thorne's hands, might eventually come to mean. Those thoughts circled at the edges of her mind whenever the work slowed enough to let them in, and she pushed them away each time, focusing instead on the next task, the next hour, the next small victory of simply getting through another day without drawing punishment down on herself. It was on the third night, lying awake long after the compound had gone quiet, that she allowed herself, finally, to cry. Not loudly, not in a way anyone could hear through the thin walls, just quiet, exhausted tears that came without warning and left her feeling, strangely, a little lighter once they had passed. She told herself this would be the only time. She told herself that tomorrow she would begin building whatever strength she needed to survive whatever came next, and she would not let this place see her broken again. She kept that promise, mostly, in the days that followed. But that first night, alone in a room that was not her own, in a pack that had already decided her worth before she ever arrived, Elena allowed herself to grieve everything she had lost, and everything she feared she might still lose before this debt was ever considered paid. There was one moment, on the fifth day, that stayed with her longer than she expected. She had been sent to beat dust from a stack of old rugs in the courtyard, a task that left her coughing and covered in grime by the time she finished, and as she worked, a small child, no older than 6 or 7, wandered close to watch her, curious, in the unguarded way of children too young to understand the rules of who deserved kindness and who did not. "Why do you work so hard?" the child asked, tilting her head. Elena paused, surprised by the question, and by the fact that anyone in this compound had spoken to her without cruelty or command. "Because it is what I am here to do," she said carefully. "My mother says you were bought," the child said, with the blunt honesty only a child could manage, like a goat. Elena felt the words land somewhere tender, though she kept her expression steady. "Something like that," she said. The child studied her a moment longer, then, without any further comment, held out a small, slightly wilted flower she had been carrying, offering it the way children offer things, without calculation or expectation of anything in return. Elena took it carefully, unsure what to say, and the child scampered off toward the kitchens before she could find the words. She kept the flower on the narrow shelf in her room for the rest of the week, until it dried and crumbled, and she told no one about the small kindness that had, for reasons she could not fully explain, meant more to her than anything else that had happened since her arrival. It was proof, however small, that not everyone within these walls saw her only as a settled debt. It was not much, but in a place that had offered her so little, it was enough to carry her through several more difficult days. The kitchens of the Blackthorn compound were already full of noise and heat when Elena arrived, still rubbing sleep from her eyes. A woman with flour dusted across her apron looked her up and down without warmth. "You're the new one," the woman said. It was not a question. "I'm old Greta. You'll do as I say in here, and you'll do it fast. We don't have time for softness." Elena nodded and said nothing. She had already decided, somewhere in the long hours of the night, that the less she said, the less power this place would have over her. Words could be twisted, silence could not. The work was hard from the first hour. She hauled water, scrubbed pots blackened by years of use, carried firewood until her arms burned. No one thanked her. No one explained anything twice. When she moved too slowly, someone barked at her to hurry. When she moved too quickly, someone accused her of trying to show off. There was no way to win, only ways to survive the day without drawing more attention than necessary. By midday, she understood the shape of her place here. She was lowest of the low, beneath even the newest servants, because everyone in the compound already knew why she had been sent. She was payment, a debt with a face. And there was a particular kind of contempt reserved for someone who had been traded like property, as if her circumstances were somehow her own fault. She caught the eye of a young man carrying trays out to the great hall, and for a moment, she thought he might offer some small kindness, a nod, anything. Instead, he looked away quickly, as though even acknowledging her might bring trouble on himself. Elena understood. She could not blame him for it. She simply filed the moment away, another small proof that she was alone here. It was near evening, when she had been sent to deliver a tray of food to one of the upper chambers, that she overheard something that would not leave her mind for the rest of the night. Two guards stood outside a heavy door, talking low, the way men talk when they think no one worth mentioning is close enough to hear. "They say the Alpha King has sent riders out again," one of them said. "Third time this year. Whole territories being searched. Man's obsessed." "Obsessed with what, exactly?" the other asked. "No one's even sure what he's looking for." "A mate," the first guard said, lowering his voice further, as though the word itself carried weight. "Caught the scent once, years back, and never found her. Some say he won't take the throne's true seat until he does. Man's been alone longer than anyone can remember. Sounds like madness to me." "Sounds like the kind of madness a king can afford," the first guard said, and they both laughed, the low, careless laugh of men discussing something that had nothing to do with their own lives. Elena kept walking, the tray steady in her hands, though something in her had gone very still. She did not know why the conversation stayed with her. She had no reason to think it had anything to do with her at all. She was a servant girl, traded away by her own family, standing in the corridor of a pack that saw her as nothing more than a settled account. Kings and their searches belonged to a different world entirely, one she had no part in and never would. And yet, as she finally returned to her small bare room that night, aching in every limb, she found herself thinking about it anyway. A man searching for years, refusing to give up on someone he had only caught a single scent of. She did not know why the image of it settled so strangely in her chest, as though it were a story she already somehow belonged inside. She pushed the thought away, and told herself it was foolishness born of exhaustion. She had far more immediate things to fear than a distant king's private sorrow. She had Garrick Thorne, and the cold stone walls of a pack that had made clear, in every possible way, that she was worth nothing to them beyond her usefulness. Still, as sleep finally pulled her under, she found herself wondering, just for a moment, what it might feel like to be searched for, to matter enough that someone would not stop looking. It was a foolish thought. She was almost certain of that. She had no way of knowing, not yet, how wrong she was. The days that followed fell into a hard, unbroken rhythm. Elena woke before the sun, worked until well after dark, and fell asleep too tired to think about anything beyond the ache in her back and the blisters forming on her hands. She told herself this was simply what survival looked like now, and she made herself accept it, because the alternative was to break, and she refused to give the Blackthorn pack the satisfaction of watching her fall apart. Old Greta remained sharp-tongued but, in her own way, fair. She never offered kindness outright, but she did not pile extra work on Elena out of cruelty either, the way some of the others seemed to enjoy doing. It was the beta of the pack, a lean, cold-eyed man named Dorian Vance, who made it his particular pleasure to remind Elena of her place. He found her on the fourth morning, scrubbing the stone floor of the entry hall, and stood over her long enough that she felt his shadow before she looked up. "You missed a spot," he said, nodding toward a corner she had already cleaned twice. Elena said nothing. She simply moved back to the corner and scrubbed it again, though she knew it was already spotless. Dorian watched her do it, and something in his expression told her this was not really about the floor at all. It was about proving he could make her do whatever he wanted, simply because he could. "You carry yourself strangely for someone who was sold," he said. "Most girls in your position cry, beg, you do neither." "Would it change anything if I did?" Elena asked, keeping her eyes on the stone. Dorian considered this, then laughed, a short, humorless sound. "No, it wouldn't, but it would be more entertaining." He walked away after that, and Elena let out a breath she had not realized she was holding. She had learned quickly that the worst thing she could do here was show fear, because fear was currency in this place, and she refused to hand any of hers over freely. It was later that same day, while she was helping carry linens through the lower halls, that she first met the pack's healer, a quiet woman named Mira, who kept mostly to herself, in a small room, lined with dried herbs and old books. Elena had cut her palm on a splintered basket handle, and one of the older servants had sent her, grumbling, to have it looked at before it turned bad. Mira examined the cut without much interest at first, cleaning it briskly, wrapping it in a strip of cloth. But as she turned Elena's hand over to check the wound had been properly covered, her fingers paused just above Elena's wrist, near a faint mark on the inside of her forearm, pale and shaped almost like the edge of a leaf, one Elena had carried her whole life and never thought much about. Mira's expression changed. It was subtle, a flicker of something behind her eyes, gone almost as quickly as it appeared, but Elena caught it. "Where did you get this?" Mira asked, her voice carefully even. "I've had it since I was born," Elena said. "My mother always said it was nothing. A birthmark." Mira did not answer right away. She turned Elena's arm slightly toward the light from the small window, studying the mark with an intensity that made Elena uneasy. "It's nothing," Mira said finally, releasing her hand. "A birthmark, as your mother said. Keep the wound clean. Change the cloth in 2 days." Elena thanked her and left, though something about the exchange sat uneasily in her chest. She could not have said exactly why, only that Mira's face, in that unguarded moment before she composed herself, had not looked like the face of a woman who believed her own words. She thought little more of it as the days wore on. There was too much else demanding her attention, too much exhaustion to spare energy on a passing moment with the healer, but Mira, it turned out, had not forgotten. That night, long after the compound had gone quiet, Mira sat alone in her small room, staring at nothing, turning over what she had seen. She was old enough to remember the stories, the ones told in hushed voices around fires when she was young, about marks that appeared only on those bound by fate to another, marks that grew warm and pulsed faintly whenever their bonded mate drew near. She had never expected to see one, not really. Most healers went their whole lives without encountering anything more than legend. And yet she had just seen one, plain as day, on the arm of a servant girl traded away like livestock to settle a debt. Mira understood, with a cold, creeping certainty, exactly what kind of danger that knowledge represented, both for the girl and for herself if she spoke of it carelessly. If Garrick Thorne learned what that mark meant, he would not free the girl out of kindness. He would see her as something far more valuable than a servant, a bargaining piece worth more than the debt that had brought her here in the first place. And there were others in this pack who would see it the same way, men who would not hesitate to use a fated bond as leverage against whoever the girl belonged to, king or otherwise. Mira made her decision that night, sitting alone with the flickering candle burning low. She would say nothing, not yet. Not until she understood more of what she was dealing with, and not until she was certain speaking would not simply hand the girl over to something even worse than what she already faced. She did not know that her silence, meant as protection, would soon collide with forces far larger than anything happening inside these stone walls. Elena, unaware of any of it, spent that same night lying awake in her narrow bed, listening to the wind move through the dark trees outside her small window. She thought, unbidden, of the conversation she had overheard days earlier, the guard speaking of a king who searched endlessly for someone he had only ever caught a single scent of. She thought of Mira's strange expression when she had looked at the mark on her arm. She told herself, as she finally drifted toward an uneasy sleep, that the two things had nothing to do with each other. She told herself that a servant girl sold to pay a debt did not get to be part of a story that large, that important, that impossible. She held on to that belief for exactly as long as it took the world outside her small window to prove her wrong. The following days brought small, strange shifts that Elena could not fully explain. Old Greta, who had never offered more than gruff instruction, began setting aside slightly better portions of food for her at the end of long shifts, never commenting on it, never acknowledging it directly, simply leaving a bowl a little fuller than the others when she thought no one else was watching. Elena did not know what to make of the gesture, but she was grateful for it in a way that surprised her, a small proof that not everyone within these walls had entirely hardened themselves against basic decency. Dorian Vance, by contrast, seemed to grow more interested in her rather than less as the days passed, appearing in corridors she happened to be walking through with a frequency that felt too consistent to be accidental. He never touched her, never threatened her outright, but his presence carried a weight that made her skin prickle every time she felt him watching. She began, without quite deciding to, mapping out routes through the compound that avoided the corridors he favored. Small adjustments that cost her extra time, but bought her a measure of peace. She found herself, more than once, thinking back to the mark on her arm, running her fingers over it absently while she worked, wondering what Mira had truly seen in that unguarded flicker of expression. She had grown up believing it was nothing more than an accident of birth, the kind of pale mark that meant nothing beyond itself. But the healer's reaction had planted a seed of doubt that would not leave her alone, no matter how firmly she tried to reason it away. There were nights she dreamed of places she had never seen, tall, pale halls and windows that looked out over land stretching further than she had ever traveled. She woke from these dreams with a strange, hollow ache in her chest, a longing for something she could not name, directed at no one and nothing she could identify. She told herself dreams meant nothing, that exhaustion produced strange imaginings in even the most ordinary of minds. But the dreams persisted, growing slightly clearer each time, until she began to dread sleep almost as much as she craved the rest it offered. She spoke to no one about them. There was no one within these walls she trusted enough to share something so strange and personal, and she had learned quickly that anything shared carelessly in this pack tended to find its way to ears it was never meant to reach. So she carried the dreams alone, turning them over in the privacy of her own mind, searching for meaning she could not yet grasp. Meanwhile, the ordinary demands of her days continued without pause. She scrubbed, she carried, she hauled and cleaned and served, earning no thanks and expecting none, simply grateful each evening to have survived another day without serious incident. She began, slowly, to understand the particular rhythms of the compound, which servants could be trusted with small kindnesses and which could not, which corners of the kitchen offered a few stolen minutes of quiet, which warriors were simply cruel out of habit, and which carried something colder and more deliberate beneath their harsh words. It was a narrow kind of life, built entirely around avoidance and endurance, but it was, for the moment, survivable. Elena told herself that survival was enough, that she did not need more than this, that hoping for anything beyond simply getting through each day was a luxury she could not afford, in a place that had made clear, from the very first night, exactly how little she was worth to the people who now controlled her fate. She did not yet understand how wrong that belief would prove to be, nor how quickly the narrow, careful life she had built for herself was about to be upended entirely, by forces she had no way of anticipating. One afternoon, sorting linens in a storage room near the edge of the compound, Elena found herself momentarily alone, a rare enough occurrence that she allowed herself to sit for a few stolen minutes on an overturned crate, resting her tired hands. Through the small window above her, she could see a slice of the world beyond Blackthorn's walls, distant hills rolling toward a horizon she could not name, and she let herself imagine, just for those few minutes, a life that existed somewhere past the reach of debts and trades, and men who decided her worth without ever asking her opinion. She did not know, in that quiet moment, that the very horizon she stared at lay in the general direction of a kingdom she had never seen, ruled by a man whose restless search was, even then, drawing gradually closer to the walls that held her. She simply watched the hills, breathed the stale air of the storage room, and allowed herself a brief, fragile taste of hope before duty called her back to the endless work that filled her days. It was a small thing, that stolen moment of rest, but it stayed with her in the days that followed, a reminder that even within the narrowest of lives, some part of her still reached instinctively towards something larger, something she could not yet name, but refused entirely to stop believing might exist. Far to the north, in a hall built from pale stone and lit by windows too tall for any ordinary building, King Cale Windmore stood alone at the edge of a balcony that looked out over territory stretching farther than most men would travel in a lifetime. He had ruled these lands for longer than most of his advisors had been alive, and in all that time, he had never once sat fully in the seat that was rightfully his. The throne behind him remained empty in the way that mattered most. He occupied the position. He commanded the armies, settled the disputes, held the borders secure against every threat that tested them. But the old laws of his bloodline said a king could not be crowned in full, could not claim the deepest power owed to his line, until he stood beside the one fate had chosen for him. And Cale had spent more years than he cared to count chasing the memory of a single moment, a scent carried on the wind decades ago, gone before he could follow it to its source. His closest advisor, a steady, graying man named Finn who had served him since they were both young, found him there on the balcony as the evening settled into full dark. "You felt something again," Finn said. It was not a question. He had known Cale long enough to read the particular stillness that came over him whenever it happened. 2 nights ago, Cale admitted. It woke me. Faint. Farther away than I've felt it in years. You've said that before, Finn said, not unkindly. And every time, the trail runs cold within days. I know how it sounds, Cale said. A king chasing ghosts. My council thinks I've lost my patience for ruling in favor of chasing a feeling I can't even properly explain. I don't think you've lost anything, Finn said. I think you've spent longer waiting than any man should have to. But Cale, we have sent riders into every territory within reach. We have searched for years. If this bond is real, and I believe that it is, perhaps it isn't meant to be found through searching at all. Cale said nothing for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the dark line of the horizon. He had heard variations of this argument more times than he could count, from advisors who meant well, from council members who did not, from his own weary mind in the quiet hours before dawn when doubt crept in easiest. I caught her scent once, he said finally, years ago, only for a moment, carried on wind from some direction I never managed to trace. I know it sounds like madness to build a life search around a single moment that lasted less time than it takes to draw a breath. But I have never, in all the years since, felt anything close to it again, until 2 nights ago. Finn was quiet for a moment, considering. What do you intend to do? Send riders south, Cale said, further than we've gone before. I don't care how thin the trail is, I have waited too long to stop chasing it now. Finn did not argue further. He had learned, over the many years of service to this king, that once Cale Windmore set his mind to something, there was little use trying to talk him out of it. He bowed his head slightly and turned to begin making the arrangements, leaving Cale alone once more with the dark horizon and the strange, persistent certainty that would not let him rest. Cale remained on the balcony long after Finn had gone, turning the feeling over in his mind, the way he had turned it over countless times before. He did not know her name. He did not know her face. He knew only the scent, faint and fleeting, and the unshakable sense that whoever carried it was, at this very moment, closer than she had ever been, and further out of reach than he could bear. He thought, as he finally turned to go inside, of all the years he had spent building a kingdom strong enough to survive without him fully seated on its throne, and he wondered, not for the first time, whether he would spend the rest of his life the same way, ruling from the edges of a life that was never meant to be lived alone. He did not allow himself to dwell on that thought for long. He had learned, out of necessity, to keep hope at a careful distance, close enough to keep him searching, far enough that its absence could not destroy him each time the trail went cold again. He did not know, as he finally left the balcony and returned to the long, quiet halls of his kingdom, that the trail that had gone cold so many times before had not gone cold at all. It had simply been buried, deep inside the walls of a pack that had no idea what they were holding, and a girl who had no idea what she carried. Cale's kingdom had grown accustomed, over the years, to the particular sadness that lived beneath their king's competent rule. He was fair, he was strong, he was respected by every pack that bordered his territory, but there was a hollowness to him that even his closest advisors had learned not to comment on directly. He attended every council session, presided over every dispute, led every campaign that threatened his people's safety, and yet there remained, always, a sense that some essential part of him was simply absent, present in body, but not fully in spirit. Finn had watched this hollowness deepen over the years with a particular ache of his own, having known Cale since they were both young enough to believe the world held nothing they could not eventually overcome through strength and determination alone. He remembered the first time Cale had spoken of the scent, decades ago now, the wonder in his voice that had gradually, over years of fruitless searching, curdled into something closer to quiet, controlled grief. You cannot keep doing this to yourself, Finn had told him once, years earlier, after a particularly exhausting search through the Eastern Territories had turned up nothing. A king cannot spend his life chasing a memory. Your people need you fully present, not divided between ruling and searching. I am aware of what my people need, Cale had answered, with more sharpness than he usually allowed himself. I have never once failed to provide it, but do not ask me to simply abandon the one thing that might make the rest of this bearable. Finn had not raised the subject again after that, understanding that some wounds, however visible, were not his to press upon. He had instead quietly supported every search Cale ordered, every rider sent out, every lead investigated, even as his own private hope for a resolution dimmed with each passing year. Now, standing in the corridor outside Cale's private chamber long after their conversation on the balcony had ended, Finn found himself allowing a flicker of that old hope to rise again, cautious but real. Something about this particular feeling seemed different from the false trails of years past. Cale had described it with a certainty in his voice that Finn had not heard in a long time, and Finn, who had learned to trust his king's instincts in matters of far greater consequence than this, found himself hoping, quietly, that this time the trail might finally lead somewhere real. He began making arrangements immediately, selecting the fastest riders in the kingdom's service, plotting routes south that had not yet been fully explored, ensuring that whatever resources Cale required for this search would be available without delay or question. He did not know, any more than Cale did, whether this new lead would prove any different from the ones that came before it, but he understood enough of his king's character to know that regardless of the outcome, nothing would stop him from following it as far as it could possibly lead. In the southern territories, unaware of any of the quiet urgency now building in the north on her behalf, Elena continued through her days exactly as she had before, her small, careful life narrowing further around the demands of survival within Blackthorn's walls. She had no reason yet to believe that anything beyond these gray stone walls had any bearing on her fate. She had no reason to believe that far away, a king who had never met her was preparing to search harder for her than he ever had for anyone in his life. That same night, hundreds of miles south, Elena finished the last of her chores, long after the rest of the compound had gone still. She carried a bucket of dirty water out to the drainage ditch behind the kitchens, moving slowly, her body worn thin from the week's labor. The night air was cold and sharp, and she paused for a moment before heading back inside, looking up at the same dark sky that stretched, unbroken, all the way to the northern territories she had never seen, and could not have imagined she had any connection to at all. She did not feel anything unusual in that moment, no pull, no certainty, nothing to mark the night as different from any other. She simply stood in the cold for a moment longer than she needed to, breathing air that felt, for reasons she could not name, slightly less suffocating than it had the night before. Then she turned and went back inside, back to her narrow bed and her bare room, with no idea that somewhere far away, a king had just decided to search harder, and closer, than he ever had before. The trouble began on a morning that started no differently than any other. Elena had been sent to the training yard to deliver water to the warriors practicing their drills, a task she disliked more than most, since it meant standing close to men who saw her as an easy target for their jokes. She kept her eyes down, moved quickly between them, and tried to finish the task before anyone decided to make sport of her. She was not quick enough. One of the younger warriors, a broad, careless man named Halric, stepped into her path just as she turned to leave, and the water pitcher she carried tipped and spilled across both of them. Halric swore loudly, more from wounded pride than any real harm, and shoved her hard enough that she stumbled backward into the training rack, catching her forearm on the sharp edge of a wooden weapon stand as she fell. The cut was not deep, but it was enough to tear her sleeve and draw blood, and enough to expose the pale, leaf-shaped mark on her inner arm, in full daylight, in front of a training yard full of Blackthorn warriors. Halric laughed at first, more concerned with his own wet clothes than her injury, but one of the older warriors, a quiet man who rarely spoke, went very still as his eyes landed on her exposed forearm. He said nothing in that moment. He simply watched, longer than was comfortable, before turning and walking briskly toward the main hall. Elena, unaware of what had drawn his attention, pressed her sleeve against the cut and hurried back toward the kitchens, embarrassed and shaken, thinking only of getting away from the training yard before anything worse happened. She did not know that the quiet warrior, a man named Corwin who had served the Blackthorn pack for over a decade, had spent years before that serving in a border territory where old stories of fated bonds were still taken seriously, where he had once seen, as a much younger man, a mark exactly like the one on Elena's arm. Corwin found Dorian Vance within the hour, catching him alone in a corridor near the war room. "I need to speak with you," Corwin said, his voice low, privately. Dorian, sensing the seriousness in his tone, led him into an empty side chamber and closed the door. "The new girl," Corwin said, "the one traded from the Alder pack. I saw a mark on her arm today, during training. I've seen its like only once before, years ago, in the Eastern Territories." "A mark," Dorian repeated, unimpressed. Servants carry all manner of scars and birthmarks. What of it? This was no ordinary birthmark, Corwin said. The shape, the placement, the way it sat against her skin. If I am right about what I saw, that girl is bonded by fate to someone. And bonds like that don't attach themselves to ordinary men. Dorian's expression shifted slowly from irritation to something sharper, more calculating. You believe she is fated to someone of standing. I believe it is possible, Corwin said carefully. I am not certain. I only know what I saw and what I remember from years ago. If I am wrong, no harm done. But if I am right, and word of this reaches the wrong ears before we understand what we are holding, we could lose whatever advantage that knowledge might give us. Dorian was quiet for a long moment, turning the possibility over with the same cold precision he brought to every decision in this pack. A servant girl, sold cheaply to settle a minor debt, might in fact be something far more valuable, a bond tied to a man of power whose identity remained unknown. The advantage in that, handled correctly, could be enormous. Say nothing of this to anyone else, Dorian finally said. Not to the Alpha, not to the others. I will look into it myself, quietly, before we decide what to do with the information. Corwin nodded, understanding the unspoken instruction well enough. Whatever value the girl carried, Dorian intended to control it, and he had no interest in sharing that control with anyone, including his own Alpha, until he understood exactly what he was dealing with. Elena, meanwhile, had gone to Mira once more, to have her new wound cleaned, unaware that the incident in the training yard had already set something dangerous into motion. Mira examined the cut in silence, her jaw tight, her movements more careful than usual. You should be more cautious around the training yard, Mira said finally, wrapping the wound with quick, practiced hands. I didn't choose to be there, Elena said. I was only bringing water. Mira did not respond right away. She finished the wrap, then held Elena's arm a moment longer than necessary, her eyes lingering on the mark that had, just hours earlier, been seen by more eyes than either of them would have wished. Elena, Mira said quietly, using her name for the first time since they had met. I need you to listen to me carefully. Whatever that mark on your arm means, and I believe it means something, you must not speak of it to anyone here. Not to old Greta, not to the other servants, not to anyone who asks. Do you understand? Elena felt a chill move through her that had nothing to do with the cool air of the healer's room. Why? What is it? I am not certain enough to say, Mira said, which was not entirely a lie, though it was not the whole truth either. But I have seen how quickly people in this pack turn information into leverage. If there is even a chance that mark means something to someone, you cannot afford for the wrong people to understand its value before you do. Elena nodded slowly, though the fear settling in her chest made it difficult to feel steady. She thought of Corwin's long, silent stare in the training yard, and understood, with sudden clarity, that whatever this mark meant, it had already been seen, and there was no way to take that back. She left Mira's room that evening, carrying a new kind of fear, one that had nothing to do with hard labor or cruel words, and everything to do with the sense that something larger than she understood was beginning to move around her, in directions she could not see, and had no power to stop. She did not know that within the same walls, Dorian Vance had already begun quietly asking questions about the Alder Pack's history, about old bloodlines, about any whispered stories of bonds and marks that might connect a small, struggling pack in the South to something, or someone, far more significant than anyone in Blackthorn territory had first assumed. The debt that had brought her here, small and unremarkable as it had seemed on the night she was traded away, was about to become something else entirely. Elena spent the following days in a state of quiet, watchful unease, aware that something had shifted around her, even if she could not name exactly what. She noticed the way certain servants now glanced at her sleeves when they thought she would not notice, the way conversations sometimes paused briefly when she entered a room, resuming only once she had moved far enough away. She said nothing about any of it, following Mira's instructions to the letter, keeping her arms covered even during the warmest hours of kitchen work, when the heat from the ovens made every other servant roll their sleeves to the elbow. She caught Corwin watching her once more, across the training yard, though he made no move to approach her directly, and she found herself grateful, in a strange way, that whatever he had seen had not translated into open cruelty. He simply watched, his expression unreadable, and Elena understood, without being told, that he was a man weighing something carefully in his own mind, though she had no way of knowing which direction his conclusions might eventually lead him. Dorian, meanwhile, grew subtly more attentive toward her, though never in ways she could point to directly as evidence of anything specific. He appeared more frequently near the kitchens. He asked old Greta idle questions about the new servant's habits, her history, anything she might know about the alder pack she had come from. Old Greta, suspicious by nature of anyone asking too many questions about someone under her charge, gave him only clipped, unhelpful answers, though she mentioned the exchange to Elena afterward with a warning look that needed no further explanation. "Keep your head down," old Greta told her. In one of the rare moments the old cook offered anything resembling advice. "Whatever attention you've drawn, it won't end well for you if it keeps growing. Men like Vance don't ask questions out of idle curiosity." Elena took the warning seriously, though there was little practical action she could take beyond continuing to keep the mark hidden and hoping whatever suspicion had been raised would eventually fade without further confirmation. She spent her evenings in Mira's small room whenever she could find an excuse, drawn by the quiet safety of the healer's presence, though Mira remained careful never to say more than she absolutely had to, aware that even trusted conversations could be overheard in a compound as watchful as this one. "Do you know what it means?" Elena finally asked her, one evening, unable to hold the question back any longer. "The mark. Truly. Not just that it might matter, but what it actually is." Mira hesitated, weighing how much to share. The old stories speak of bonds formed before birth, tying two people together, across whatever distance separates them, until the day they finally meet. The mark is meant to be a sign of that bond, visible only on the one who carries it, though I have read that the one who shares the bond carries something similar, in his own way, even if it is not always visible to the eye. "And you believe I carry one of these bonds?" Elena said slowly. "I believe it is possible," Mira said. "I have never seen a mark quite like yours before, not in all my years of practice. That alone tells me it is not ordinary. Beyond that, I cannot say with certainty what it means, or who it might connect you to. Only that such bonds, when real, are rare enough that anyone who suspects you carry one will see enormous value in that suspicion, regardless of whether they care at all for your own well-being." Elena absorbed this in silence, turning the information over carefully. She thought of the guard's conversation weeks earlier, the king, who searched endlessly for someone he had only caught a single scent of. She did not allow herself to draw any direct connection between that story and her own circumstances, telling herself the idea was too large, too improbable, to be anything more than coincidence. But some small, persistent part of her could not quite let the thought go entirely, no matter how firmly she tried to reason it away. She left Mira's room that night more unsettled than before, carrying a secret she barely understood herself, in a pack that had already begun, quietly and dangerously, to wonder exactly how much that secret might be worth. Word arrived at the Blackthorn compound 10 days later that a delegation from the Northern Territories would be passing through on a matter of trade agreements, a routine visit meant to secure safe passage rights along the border roads. Garrick Thorne, eager to strengthen his pack's standing with more powerful neighbors, ordered a formal reception, and every servant in the compound was pressed into preparation. Elena spent 2 full days scrubbing the great hall, polishing silver, and helping carry in fresh linens for the visiting party, grateful, in a strange way, for work that at least felt different from her usual routine. She had almost forgotten about the incident in the training yard, though the mark on her arm remained hidden now beneath long sleeves she wore, even in the growing warmth of the season, a habit Mira had quietly encouraged without explaining why. The delegation arrived on a gray afternoon, a modest party of 6 riders, led by a sharp-eyed man named Ronan, who served as one of King Cale Winmore's most trusted envoys. Elena caught only glimpses of them as they were led into the great hall, too busy with her duties in the kitchens to pay much attention to the formalities of trade negotiations that had nothing to do with her. It was later that evening, while she carried a tray of refreshments into a side chamber where the envoy's smaller party had gathered to rest before the formal dinner, that everything shifted. Ronan looked up as she entered, and for a moment, something in his expression sharpened, the way a hunting dog goes still at the first hint of a scent it recognizes. He said nothing at first, watching her set the tray down and begin to leave, but as she passed close enough, he inhaled slowly, almost imperceptibly, and his entire posture changed. "Wait," he said, Elena froze, unsure whether she had done something wrong. "Sir?" Ronan studied her for a long moment, his sharp eyes moving over her face, then down to the long sleeves covering her arms, as though he already suspected what lay beneath them. "What is your name?" "Elena," she said carefully. "Elena," he repeated, as though testing the shape of it. "How long have you served this pack?" "A little over 2 months," she said, growing more uneasy with each question. Ronan glanced at the other members of his party, a silent exchange passing between them that Elena could not interpret. "You may go," he said finally, though his eyes lingered on her as she left the room, and she could feel his attention following her long after the door had closed behind her. That night, once the formal dinner had ended and the compound had settled into an uneasy quiet, Ronan sought out a private moment with one of his most trusted riders, a younger man named Bram, in the small guest chamber they had been given for the night. "I need you to leave before dawn," Ronan said quietly. "Ride hard for the capital. Do not stop unless your horse forces you to." Bram straightened, sensing the seriousness in his voice. "What message do I carry?" "Tell the king," Ronan said, "that I believe I have found her scent, faint but unmistakable, carried on a servant girl in the Blackthorn compound. Her name is Elena. I cannot be certain until he confirms it himself, but I have not been wrong about a scent in 20 years of service, and I am not wrong now." Bram's eyes widened slightly. "You understand what this will mean, if you are right. He will not wait for confirmation through proper channels. He will come himself." "I know," Ronan said. "That is precisely why the message must reach him as quickly as possible, and precisely why you must tell no one else what you carry. If word of this reaches the wrong ears within this pack, before the king arrives, I fear what they might do with a girl they realize is worth far more than the debt that brought her here." Bram left before the first light of dawn touched the sky, riding north with a message that would change the course of everything that followed, while Elena, unaware entirely of what had been set into motion, slept fitfully in her small room, disturbed by dreams she could not quite remember upon waking, dreams that left her with a strange, unplaceable ache in her chest. Ronan remained at the Blackthorn compound for 2 more days, completing the trade negotiations with careful, deliberate patience, watching Elena from a distance whenever their paths crossed, careful never to draw further attention to her. He noticed, with growing unease, that Dorian Vance seemed to watch her too, with an interest that had nothing to do with her duties as a servant. On the morning the delegation prepared to depart, Ronan found a brief moment alone with Mira, having learned during his stay that she served as the pack's healer, and might, therefore, know something useful about the girl who had captured his attention so completely. "The girl, Elena," he said carefully, keeping his voice low. "Does she carry any unusual marking? On her arm, perhaps?" Mira's expression tightened, and for a moment, Ronan thought she might refuse to answer entirely. "Why do you ask?" "Because if she does," Ronan said, "then I believe she is someone very important to someone very powerful, and I believe that importance may soon place her in more danger than she currently understands." Mira studied him for a long moment, weighing whether to trust a stranger from a pack she knew almost nothing about. But something in his careful, urgent tone convinced her that he meant the girl no harm, and that his concern, unlike Dorian's calculating interest, came from something closer to genuine alarm. "She has a mark," Mira admitted quietly. "I have told her to keep it hidden. I fear others here have already begun to suspect what it might mean." Ronan's expression darkened. "Then we have less time than I hoped. Watch her closely, healer. Protect her however you are able. Help is coming, but it will not arrive as quickly as I would like." He left the compound that same morning, his delegation riding hard for the northern border, leaving behind a healer now burdened with the full weight of a secret she could no longer carry alone, and a girl who remained entirely unaware that the quiet stranger who had questioned her so briefly had just set into motion the very thing that would change the course of her life forever. Elena spent that day exactly as she had spent every day before it, scrubbing floors and hauling water, unaware that far to the north, a rider pushed his horse harder than he ever had before, carrying a message that would soon bring a king to her door. The days following the delegation's departure passed with an unusual quiet, though it was the kind of quiet that Elena, by now, had learned to distrust. Garrick seemed distracted, spending long hours in his private chamber with Dorian and a handful of trusted advisors, their voices too low to carry through the heavy doors, their expressions, whenever they emerged, carefully composed, in ways that suggested important decisions were being weighed. Elena continued her work as though nothing had changed, though she carried, now, a persistent awareness that something significant had passed close by her, without fully touching her yet. She thought often of the sharp-eyed envoy, who had asked her name with such unusual intensity, replaying the moment in her mind whenever her hands were occupied with mindless, repetitive tasks. She did not understand what he had seen in her, or why the question of her name had seemed to matter so much to a man who had no reason to care about a servant girl's identity. Mira, for her part, grew increasingly watchful in the days that followed, finding small excuses to check on Elena more frequently than her duties strictly required. She did not explain the reason for her growing concern, and Elena, sensing the healer's unease, did not press for answers she suspected would not yet be given freely. It was nearly a week after the delegation's departure that the first signs of change began to show themselves more clearly. Riders were spotted along the eastern road, moving with a purpose and speed that immediately drew the attention of the compound's watchmen. Word spread quickly among the servants, whispered from kitchen to courtyard to stable, that a party from the northern territories had been seen crossing into Blackthorn lands, moving faster than any ordinary trade caravan would travel. Garrick received the report with visible tension, calling an immediate council of his senior advisors to discuss what such an unexpected arrival might mean. Dorian, present at the meeting, offered his own theory, with the calm certainty of a man who believed he had already anticipated exactly this outcome. "The girl," he said simply. "Whatever Corwin saw on her arm, it seems the northern envoy saw it too, or sensed something during his visit that has now brought further attention from the north. We should have moved more carefully before allowing her anywhere near that delegation." There was no reason to expect such scrutiny over a servant girl, Garrick said, though his tone carried less certainty than his words suggested. "We could not have known." "Perhaps not," Dorian said, "but we know now. The question is what we intend to do about it before whoever is coming arrives and makes their intentions clear." The council debated long into the evening, weighing various strategies for handling whatever was approaching, though none of them yet understood the full scale of what was actually converging on their compound. Garrick, ever calculating, began to see the situation less as a threat and more as an opportunity, a chance to extract value from circumstances that had, until now, seemed entirely outside his control. Elena remained unaware of the council's deliberations, continuing her duties with the same careful diligence she had maintained since her first day within these walls. She noticed, however, the increased activity throughout the compound, the extra guards posted along the outer walls, the tension that seemed to hum beneath every conversation she overheard in passing. She did not know what was coming. She only understood, with the same instinct that had helped her survive every difficult turn since her arrival, that whatever it was, it would change something significant about her circumstances, for better or for worse. She spent that final quiet evening before everything changed, sitting alone in her small room, staring at the pale mark on her arm in the dim candlelight, wondering, not for the first time, what exactly she carried within her own skin, and what it might eventually cost her to find out. Earlier that same evening, she had passed close enough to Garrick's private chamber to catch a fragment of the council's discussion through the heavy door, a habit she had not intended to develop, but which survival within these walls had slowly taught her regardless. She heard her own name mentioned, followed by words she could not fully make out, and then Dorian's voice, low and deliberate, speaking of value and timing, and the importance of controlling how information reached the approaching riders. She had not lingered long enough to hear more, aware that being caught listening at doors would only worsen whatever precarious position she already occupied. But the fragment she carried away with her sat uneasily in her chest for the rest of the night, confirming what she had already begun to suspect, that whatever was approaching the compound had everything to do with her, and that the men currently deciding how to handle it cared nothing at all for what she herself might want. She thought, not for the first time, of simply asking Mira directly what she believed was happening, but she held back, unwilling to place the healer in a position where she might be forced to lie or reveal more than she safely could. Instead, Elena resolved to wait, to watch, and to trust her own instincts to guide her through whatever came next, exactly as they had guided her through every difficult moment since the night she was first traded away. Bram reached the northern capital in half the time it should have taken, his horse lathered and exhausted, his own body barely able to remain upright by the time he was brought before King Cale Windmore in the Great Hall. "Speak," Cale said, rising from his seat the moment he saw the state of the messenger before him. "A message from Ronan, my king," Bram said, still catching his breath. "He believes he has found her. A servant girl in the Blackthorn compound, in the Southern Territories. Her name is Elena. He says the scent was faint but unmistakable." Cale went very still. He had heard false hopes before, whispers and rumors that led nowhere, trails that dissolved the moment he arrived to follow them. But Ronan was not a man given to false claims. In 20 years of service, his instincts regarding scent and bond had never once been wrong. "How certain is he?" Cale asked, though he already knew he would go regardless of the answer. "Certain enough to send me riding through the night without rest," Bram said. "He asked that you come yourself, my king, and quickly. He fears the pack holding her may already suspect her worth." Cale did not hesitate. Within the hour, he had summoned his fastest riders, left Finn in temporary command of the capital, and set out south with a small, swift party, driven by a hope he had guarded so carefully for so long that he barely recognized the feeling of letting it loose completely. The ride south felt, to Cale, both impossibly long and impossibly fast. He had spent decades imagining this moment in countless forms, and none of them had prepared him for the reality of finally approaching it. He thought of every year spent refusing the full weight of his throne, every advisor who had gently suggested he move on, every night he had stood alone on that northern balcony, waiting for a feeling that never fully left him, no matter how many false trails had come before. They reached the border of Blackthorn territory on the evening of the third day, and Cale felt it, before they had even crossed fully into the pack's lands. A pull, faint but unmistakable, growing stronger with every mile his horse carried him closer to the compound's high stone walls. Garrick Thorne received the unexpected arrival of the Alpha King with a mixture of confusion and wary calculation, quickly ordering the compound prepared for a formal reception he had no time to properly arrange. He had no understanding yet of why the Northern King had arrived so suddenly, without the usual formalities of advance notice, but he understood enough to know that whatever the reason, it likely represented an opportunity, one he intended to exploit fully. Elena was in the kitchens when the commotion began, servants rushing in every direction, whispered word spreading quickly that the Alpha King himself had arrived unannounced. She felt the pull of curiosity along with everyone else, though she had no reason to think his arrival had anything to do with her. She was sent, along with several other servants, to help prepare the great hall for a hastily arranged dinner, and it was there, carrying a tray of goblets toward the long table, that she first saw him. Cale stood near the entrance of the hall, tall and composed despite the exhaustion of hard travel, his eyes moving across the room, with the careful attention of a man, searching for something specific among a crowd of strangers. And then his gaze found her, and everything in him went still. The scent hit him first, unmistakable, exactly as Ronan had described, growing stronger with every step that closed the distance between them. Beneath it, something deeper settled into place, a recognition that had nothing to do with memory, and everything to do with instinct, as though some essential piece of himself, missing for as long as he could remember, had finally been returned. Elena felt it too, though she had no framework to understand what she was feeling. The moment his eyes met hers, something shifted in her chest, warm and disorienting, a pull she could not name and had no reason to expect. She stood frozen for a moment longer than propriety allowed, the tray of goblets nearly slipping from her hands, before she forced herself to look away and continue toward the table, her heart pounding in a way that had nothing to do with fear. Garrick, watching the exchange with sharp, calculating eyes, understood immediately that something significant had just occurred, though he did not yet grasp the full shape of it. "You seem interested in my servant, my king," Garrick said carefully, stepping forward with a smile that did not reach his eyes. Cale turned his attention to Garrick slowly, deliberately, and something cold entered his expression, the bearing of a man who ruled vast territories and answered to no one, settling fully into place. "Her name is Elena." Garrick's smile faltered slightly, surprised the king already knew her name. "She serves in our kitchens, a recent addition to our household. I am aware of how she came to be here," Cale said. "I am also aware that she does not belong to this pack. whatever arrangement was made to bring her within these walls. Garrick's expression sharpened, understanding now settling in fully. He glanced toward Elena, standing frozen near the long table, and then back to the king, calculating quickly how this new knowledge might be turned to his advantage. She was traded fairly, to settle a debt owed by her home pack, Garrick said. She belongs to Blackthorn by law, until that debt is considered paid. Then I suggest, Cale said, his voice carrying the quiet, absolute authority of a man who had never needed to raise his voice to be obeyed, that we discuss, formally and immediately, exactly what it will take to consider that debt settled. The great hall had gone completely silent, every servant and warrior present sensing that something far larger than a simple dinner had just begun to unfold. Elena stood among them, still holding the tray she had nearly dropped, watching the king who had somehow known her name before she had ever spoken it to him, feeling the strange, undeniable pull toward him that she could not begin to explain. She did not yet understand what she was to him. She only understood, with a certainty that frightened her, that nothing about her life would be simple again after tonight. The formal dinner that followed was, for Elena, an exercise in careful discipline. She had been assigned to help serve the visiting delegation, a task she would normally have found simply tedious, but which now felt charged with an unbearable tension every time her duties brought her near the head table where Cale sat. She felt his attention on her even when she kept her own eyes carefully lowered, a warmth that seemed to reach across the room regardless of distance, impossible to ignore, and equally impossible to explain. Garrick, seated beside his unexpected guest, worked hard throughout the meal to maintain an appearance of gracious hospitality, though Elena could sense the calculation running beneath every pleasant word he offered. He asked polite questions about the northern territories, about trade routes and border security, all the ordinary business of two rulers meeting under diplomatic circumstances. But his eyes returned, again and again, to Elena whenever she moved through the hall, and Elena understood, with growing unease, that he was already beginning to piece together exactly what he might be holding. Cale, for his part, said little during the meal itself, though his composure carried a stillness that Elena found herself drawn to, even as she tried to focus on her duties. He asked no direct questions about her, made no obvious display of interest that might have drawn further attention, but there was something in the careful, deliberate way he tracked her movements around the hall that told her this was a man, exercising enormous restraint, holding something back that clearly wanted to break free. It was near the end of the meal, as servants began clearing the final course, that their eyes met again, briefly, across the crowded hall. Elena, carrying an empty tray back toward the kitchens, felt the same overwhelming pull she had experienced upon first seeing him, and for a moment, neither of them looked away. Something passed between them in that silent exchange, unspoken but unmistakable, a recognition that neither fully understood, but both felt with equal intensity. Garrick noticed the exchange, his expression sharpening further, and Elena, catching sight of his calculating gaze moving between herself and the king, quickly broke eye contact and hurried the rest of the way to the kitchens, her heart pounding with a mixture of confusion and fear. Old Greta caught her arm as she set the tray down, studying her flushed face with narrowed eyes. "What happened out there?" "Nothing," Elena said quickly, though her voice did not sound entirely steady even to her own ears. "I am only tired." Old Greta did not look convinced, but she did not press further, simply returning to her own work, with a thoughtful expression that suggested she had noticed more than she chose to comment on aloud. Elena spent the remainder of the evening in a kind of daze, moving through her duties mechanically, while her mind circled endlessly around the strange, overwhelming sensation of standing near the Northern King. She had no framework to understand what she was experiencing, no context for the pull that seemed to grow stronger every time their paths crossed, however briefly. She only knew that something fundamental had shifted within her the moment their eyes had first met, and that shift showed no sign of fading now that the meal had ended. Later that night, long after the compound had finally settled into an uneasy quiet, Elena lay awake staring at the low ceiling of her small room, replaying the moment again and again in her mind. She thought of the strange dreams that had haunted her sleep in recent weeks, the tall, pale halls and endless windows she had never actually seen, and wondered, with a growing sense of certainty she could not fully explain, whether those dreams had somehow been leading her toward exactly this moment all along. She did not sleep well that night, her mind too full of questions she had no answers for. her chest carrying a warmth she could not extinguish no matter how firmly she tried to reason it away, as simple exhaustion or imagination. Something had begun the moment Cale Winmore walked into the great hall, and Elena understood, even without fully grasping its shape yet, that there would be no going back to the careful, narrow life she had built for herself in the weeks before his arrival. The formal discussion took place the following morning in Garrick's private chamber, a room chosen deliberately to put the visiting king at a disadvantage, surrounded by blackthorn symbols of power rather than neutral ground. Cale arrived accompanied only by 2 of his own guards, refusing the larger show of force his advisors had suggested, though the quiet authority he carried needed no additional display. "I will speak plainly," Cale said, once the necessary formalities had been observed. "The girl you call Elena carries a bond to me, recognized under the oldest laws shared by every pack in these territories, laws that predate any debt or trade agreement your pack might claim over her. I am prepared to settle whatever sum the Alder pack owed you, many times over, to see her released immediately." Garrick leaned back in his chair, studying the king with the careful patience of a man who understood he now held something of unexpected value. "A generous offer, my king, but you must understand my position. The girl was traded to my pack under proper law, in exchange for forgiving a debt of considerable weight. If she is indeed bonded to you, as you claim, then her value to my pack is far greater than any sum of coin could represent." "You intend to use her as leverage," Cale said, his voice flat and cold. "I intend to negotiate fairly," Garrick said, "for something that has clearly become far more valuable than either party understood at the time of the original trade." Cale's jaw tightened, though he kept his composure with visible effort. He had faced difficult negotiations before, but none where the stakes felt so entirely, painfully personal. "What is it you want, Thorn? Speak clearly, and let us settle this quickly." Garrick smiled, the expression cold and calculating. "Land rights along the eastern border, currently disputed between our territories. Full trade privileges through the northern passes, without the usual tariffs. And a formal alliance between our packs, binding for at least a generation, to be sealed by whatever means you find appropriate." The demands were steep, deliberately so, designed to extract maximum advantage from a situation Garrick understood he might never encounter again. Cale listened without interrupting, his mind working quickly through the political consequences each demand would carry, the precedent it would set, the concessions his own counsel would resist bitterly once he returned home to explain them. "I will not agree to terms that weaken my own territories for generations to come," Cale said finally. "Land rights and trade privileges I am prepared to discuss reasonably. A binding alliance sealed on terms dictated entirely by you, I will not accept." Garrick's expression hardened. "Then perhaps we have nothing further to discuss, my king. The girl remains a servant of my pack, and I see no urgent reason to release her while negotiations continue, at whatever pace suits us both." The threat, though carefully worded, was unmistakable. Garrick intended to hold Elena within his walls indefinitely, using her presence as continued leverage for as long as it took to extract terms favorable to his own pack, regardless of what that delay might cost her. Cale rose from his seat, his expression carefully controlled despite the fury building beneath it. "You should understand something clearly, Thorn, before this goes any further. I did not come here to negotiate as a supplicant. I came here as a king, invoking rights recognized by every pack that values the old laws, rights that supersede any trade agreement, made in ignorance of what was actually being exchanged. I am offering you the chance to resolve this with dignity and fair compensation. I suggest you consider that offer carefully, before deciding to test how far I am willing to go otherwise." Garrick did not answer immediately, weighing the implicit warning against the value of what he currently held. He had heard stories of the Northern King's strength, of battles won decisively against packs far larger than his own, but he had also built his own reputation on never backing down from a position of apparent advantage. "I will consider your offer," Garrick said finally. "You may remain within my territory while I do so. But I trust you understand that patience, in matters such as this, tends to favor whoever holds the stronger position." Cale left the chamber without further comment, understanding fully that the conversation had settled nothing, and that Garrick intended to draw this out for as long as it benefited him to do so. Elena, meanwhile, had been confined to the kitchens under stricter watch than usual. Dorian Vance having quietly instructed the other servants to keep close attention on her movements, ensuring she had no opportunity to seek out the Northern King or his party without oversight. She felt the tension throughout the compound as clearly as anyone, the whispered conversations that stopped abruptly whenever she entered a room, the careful, calculating glances from warriors who had never bothered to look at her twice before. She understood, without anyone explaining it directly, that whatever had happened in the Great Hall the previous evening had changed everything about her position within these walls. It was Mira who finally found a private moment to speak with her honestly, drawing her into the small healer's room under the pretense of checking her earlier wound. "The king believes you are bonded to him," Mira said quietly, once the door had closed behind them. "A fated bond, recognized under the oldest laws our kind still honors. That is what the mark on your arm means, Elena. It is why I told you to keep it hidden." Elena absorbed this slowly, the pieces of the past weeks finally settling into a shape she could understand. The guard's conversation about a king who searched endlessly. The strange pull she had felt the moment Kale's eyes met hers across the Great Hall. The warmth that had spread through her chest, inexplicable and undeniable. "And Garrick," Elena said slowly, "intends to use that against him." "He intends to use it for whatever advantage he can extract," Mira said. "Land, trade rights, alliances built on your value rather than your well-being. I do not believe he cares at all what any of this costs you personally." Elena felt something harden inside her chest, a resolve she had not expected to find so quickly. She had spent weeks accepting her powerlessness within these walls, accepting that her fate belonged entirely to men who saw her as nothing more than property, to be traded and leveraged. But something had shifted now, some quiet certainty that she was not, in fact, as powerless as she had believed. "I will not simply wait to see what they decide for me," Elena said. Mira studied her for a long moment, something like respect entering her expression. "No," she agreed, "I do not believe you should." That resolve carried Elena through the following days with a steadiness that surprised even herself. She continued her duties without complaint, careful to avoid drawing further suspicion, but beneath the surface of her ordinary routine, she had begun quietly observing everything around her, with a sharper, more deliberate attention than before. She noted which guards patrolled which halls, and when. She noted the times Garrick's private chamber stood empty, and when it did not. She noted, most importantly, the growing tension between the pack's leadership and the Northern King's continued presence within their walls. Kale, for his part, had not left the Blackthorn compound despite the stalled negotiations, choosing instead to remain nearby, his party housed in guest quarters that Garrick had reluctantly provided. He understood the risk of appearing too eager, too desperate, in front of a man who would exploit any visible weakness for further advantage. But he also understood, with a certainty that had only deepened since first seeing her in the Great Hall, that he would not simply ride away and leave Elena within these walls while further negotiations dragged on indefinitely. He found small, careful ways to see her during those days, moments arranged with enough discretion to avoid drawing Garrick's direct suspicion, though he knew Dorian's watchful presence made even brief encounters a risk. Their conversations, when they managed them, were brief and quiet, exchanged in corridors or courtyards where their paths crossed under plausible enough circumstances. "You should not be here," Elena told him once, during one such brief exchange near the kitchen gardens, though her voice carried no real conviction behind the warning. "Perhaps not," Kale admitted, "but I find myself unable to stay entirely away, regardless of what caution suggests." "Garrick will use whatever advantage he can find," Elena said, "including this, if he sees it." "I am aware," Kale said, "but I have spent longer than I care to admit searching for you, without even a face to picture, without even a name. Now that I have found both, I find my patience for careful diplomacy considerably thinner than it once was." Elena studied him carefully in the fading afternoon light, searching his expression for any sign of the calculation she had grown so accustomed to seeing in every other man who had claimed some stake in her fate since the night she was traded away. She found none. Only a quiet, steady honesty that unsettled her more than any deception could have, because it left her with no easy way to guard herself against the growing pull she felt toward him. "I do not know what I am supposed to feel," she admitted quietly. "Everyone speaks of this bond as though it decides everything on its own, as though I have no choice in the matter at all. You have every choice, Cale said, his voice firm despite its quiet tone. Whatever the old laws say about bonds and fate, I would never force you into anything you did not choose freely for yourself. I have waited decades for this. I can wait longer still, if that is what you need. Elena felt something in her chest loosen slightly at his words, a tension she had been carrying since the moment their eyes first met in the great hall. She did not yet know what she wanted, not fully, not with the clarity she suspected the moment deserved, but she understood, hearing the sincerity in his voice, that whatever came next would not be decided for her without her own consent, and that realization alone offered a measure of comfort she had not expected to find within these cold stone walls. Their conversation ended quickly after that, interrupted by the approach of a passing servant, and Cale withdrew with a final, lingering glance, before disappearing back toward the guest quarters. Elena remained in the garden a moment longer, turning his words over carefully in her mind, allowing herself, for the first time since her arrival at Blackthorn, to imagine a future that held something more than mere survival within it. Word of what was happening within the Blackthorn compound traveled faster than anyone had anticipated, carried south along trade routes by riders and merchants who understood the value of interesting news. Within days, word reached the Alder Pack itself, and Elena's uncle, a quiet, weathered man named Edmund, who had never fully agreed with her father's decision to trade her away, made the journey south without informing anyone of his intentions. Edmund arrived at the edge of Blackthorn territory on foot, having traveled the final distance without a horse, to avoid drawing unwanted attention, and requested an audience with Garrick Thorne, claiming family business regarding the girl traded, to settle the Alder Pack's debt. Garrick, curious what an unannounced relative might want, agreed to see him, and Edmund was brought into the same private chamber where the tense negotiations with King Cale had taken place days earlier. "I have come to see my niece," Edmund said simply, "and to understand what I am hearing regarding her circumstances. Your niece has become considerably more valuable than anyone anticipated at the time of her trade," Garrick said, watching the older man carefully. "I assume you have heard the rumors regarding a certain northern king's interest in her." "I have heard enough to be concerned for her safety," Edmund said. "I would like to see her, and to understand for myself what is being decided on her behalf." Garrick considered the request, weighing what advantage, if any, might come from allowing the visit. He decided, after a moment, that there was little harm in it, and perhaps some benefit in appearing reasonable to outside observers while negotiations with the king continued. Elena was summoned from the kitchens and brought to a small side room where Edmund waited, and the moment she saw him, something in her chest tightened with a complicated mixture of relief and old, unresolved anger. "Uncle Edmund," she said carefully, "I did not expect to see you here." "I heard what has happened," Edmund said, his weathered face showing genuine concern as he studied her. "I could not simply stay away, not after everything. I want you to know, Elena, I argued against your trade from the very beginning. Your father would not listen. That does not change that it happened," Elena said, unable to keep a note of bitterness from her voice. "Or that you did not come to help me until now, when I have apparently become valuable enough to be worth the journey." Edmund flinched at the accusation, though he did not deny the truth in it entirely. "You are right to be angry. I have no excuse good enough to offer you, but I am here now, and I want to help you, whatever that help might look like." Elena studied her uncle carefully, uncertain how much of his sudden concern she could trust. She had learned, in the weeks since her arrival at Blackthorn, that people's intentions rarely aligned cleanly with their words, and family loyalty had already proven itself unreliable once before. "What kind of help do you have in mind?" she asked carefully. "I have connections still, within the southern territories," Edmund said. "I could help you disappear, if that is what you wanted, somewhere neither this pack nor any king could easily find you. Or, if you prefer, I could speak on your behalf in whatever negotiations are taking place. Ensure your own interests are represented rather than simply traded between men who see you as a bargaining piece." Elena considered this carefully. Disappearing held a certain appeal, the promise of finally controlling her own fate after months of having it decided entirely by others. But something in her resisted the idea just as strongly, some instinct that told her running now, before she understood the full shape of what was happening to her, might mean running from something she did not yet fully understand she wanted. I need time to think, she said finally. This is a great deal to decide quickly. Of course, Edmund said. Take whatever time you need. I will remain nearby, in case you decide you want my help. Elena left the meeting with her thoughts more tangled than before, uncertain whether her uncle's sudden appearance represented genuine concern or another form of calculation, another person seeing an opportunity in her changed circumstances. She thought of the strange pull she had felt toward Cale in the great hall, the certainty in his eyes when he had looked at her, and she found herself, despite everything, unwilling to simply vanish before understanding what that pull might mean. That same evening, Dorian Vance, having learned of Edmund's visit through his network of informants within the compound, decided the situation had grown complicated enough to require more decisive action. He found Garrick in his private chamber, going over correspondence related to the ongoing negotiations with the Northern King. The girl's uncle arrived today, Dorian said, claiming concern for her welfare. I suspect his true purpose is to help her escape before we conclude negotiations with the king. Garrick's expression darkened. If she disappears now, we lose all leverage. The king will assume we allowed it deliberately, or worse, that we harmed her ourselves. Then perhaps, Dorian said carefully, we should move her somewhere more secure, away from prying uncles and northern kings alike, until terms can be properly settled. Garrick considered this, weighing the risk of angering the king further against the risk of losing his advantage entirely. Where would you suggest? The old hunting lodge, 2 days' ride east, Dorian said. Isolated, easily guarded, far enough that neither her uncle nor the king's people could easily track her there. We move her quietly, before either of them realizes what has happened. Garrick nodded slowly, the decision settling into place with cold, calculated finality. Arrange it, quietly, and quickly. I want her moved before dawn. Neither man considered, in that moment, what such a decision might cost them once the king discovered what had been done. Nor did they fully understand that Elena, given the choice between vanishing with her uncle or remaining to face whatever came next, had already begun to decide, on her own terms, exactly what she intended to do. She would not simply wait to be moved like property between men who saw her only as leverage. Whatever happened next, she intended to have a voice in deciding it herself. That resolve was tested sooner than she expected. Elena returned to her small room after her conversation with Edmund, carrying a heaviness she had not felt in weeks. The old wound of her family's betrayal reopened alongside the new uncertainty of what her uncle's sudden concern truly meant. She sat on the edge of her narrow bed for a long time, turning the possibilities over in her mind, weighing the safety of disappearing entirely against the pull she felt toward a future she was only beginning to understand. She thought of Cale's words in the garden, his promise that whatever came next would be her choice and no one else's. She thought of the years he had spent searching, the certainty in his voice when he spoke of the bond between them, and she thought, too, of the danger that certainty now placed her in, surrounded by men who saw her value only in terms of what it could earn them, regardless of the cost to her own safety or well-being. She did not seek out her uncle again that evening, needing time alone to sort through the tangle of her own feelings before committing to any decision. But she noticed, in the hours that followed, an increased watchfulness among the guards stationed near the servants' quarters, a subtle tightening of the usual patrol patterns that told her something had shifted in the compound's leadership. She did not yet know what had prompted the change, only that instinct told her to remain alert. Mira found her briefly before the household retired for the night, her expression tight with a concern she did not fully explain. Be careful these next few days, the healer said quietly. I do not know exactly what is being planned, but I have heard enough whispered between Dorian and the Alpha to know that something is being decided, and I fear it does not favor your safety.
What kind of decision?
Elena asked, her earlier resolve hardening into something sharper, more watchful. I am not certain, Mira admitted, but if I learn more, I will find a way to tell you. In the meantime, trust no one within these walls beyond myself, and, perhaps, Corwin, if it comes to that. I have reason to believe his conscience troubles him more than he lets on. Elena carried that warning with her as she finally returned to her room for the night, sleep coming slowly and unevenly despite her exhaustion. She woke several times in the darkness, certain she had heard footsteps outside her door, though each time she found the corridor empty when she finally worked up the courage to check. By the time true exhaustion finally pulled her under, the night had grown thin, the first hints of the coming dawn already beginning to soften the darkness beyond her small window. She did not know, as she finally slept, how little time remained before that same dawn would bring men to her door, with orders to move her far beyond the reach of anyone who might come looking. She did not know that her uncle's offer to help her disappear, and her own quiet decision to remain and fight for whatever future she might build here, were both about to be overtaken entirely by a scheme neither of them had anticipated, one that would strip away her choice far more completely than either option she had spent the evening weighing so carefully. Elena woke well before dawn to the quiet sound of her door being unlocked, and she was on her feet instantly, every instinct sharpened by weeks of learning to read danger within these walls. 2 Blackthorn warriors stood in the doorway, their expressions carefully blank in the way of men following orders they had not been given the full context to question. "You are being moved," one of them said. "Gather nothing. We leave now." Elena's mind raced quickly through what this meant. Garrick had decided, clearly, that hiding her somewhere beyond the reach of both her uncle and the Northern King served his interests better than continuing to negotiate under pressure. She understood, in that instant, that once she was taken from this compound to wherever they intended to hide her, her chance to shape her own fate would narrow considerably. She did not resist as they led her through the dark corridors, understanding that resistance now would accomplish nothing beyond drawing unwanted attention before she had a clear plan. Instead, she paid careful attention to every turn, every doorway, every detail that might prove useful later, the same instincts that had helped her survive the past weeks, now sharpening into something closer to strategy. As they crossed the outer courtyard toward the stables, Elena caught sight of a familiar figure moving quietly along the shadows near the kitchen entrance. Mira, awake at this early hour for reasons of her own, froze when she saw the small procession crossing the courtyard, understanding immediately what was happening. Their eyes met for a brief moment, and Elena saw something resolve itself in the healer's expression, a decision made in an instant. Mira turned and disappeared back toward the kitchens, moving with a purpose that gave Elena a small, fragile thread of hope. She was loaded onto a horse between 2 guards, her wrists bound loosely enough to allow her to hold the reins but tightly enough to prevent any attempt at escape, and the small party set out east, away from the compound, just as the first gray light of dawn began to touch the horizon. What Elena did not know was that Mira, upon reaching the kitchens, had gone directly to find Corwin, the warrior whose sharp eyes had first noticed her mark weeks earlier. Corwin, unlike Dorian, had grown uneasy with the direction events had taken, uncomfortable with the idea of a fated bond being used purely as a bargaining chip, regardless of the cost to the girl herself. "They've moved her," Mira said urgently. "East, toward the old hunting lodge, I believe. You need to get word to the king's party before the trail grows cold." Corwin did not hesitate. He understood the risk of what he was about to do, betraying his own pack's leadership to warn a foreign king, but something in him had settled on the belief that this particular scheme had crossed a line he was unwilling to quietly support. He found Ronan's remaining contact within the compound, a young rider who had stayed behind under the guise of finalizing minor trade details, and relayed the information as quickly as he could. The rider left within minutes, racing toward the small camp where King Kale and his party had been staying just outside Blackthorn territory, waiting with mounting frustration for negotiations that showed no sign of concluding fairly. Kale received the news with a fury that his advisors had rarely witnessed in him before, the careful composure he had maintained throughout the negotiations finally giving way entirely. "They mean to hide her from me," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "After everything, they mean to simply take her and vanish." "My king," one of his guards said carefully, "if we ride now, in force, it may be read as an act of aggression against Blackthorn territory. There could be consequences." "There will be far greater consequences," Kale said, already moving toward his horse, "if I allow them to disappear with her, while I stand here weighing diplomatic niceties. Ready the riders, we move now." The pursuit that followed cut across rough terrain, at a pace that pushed both horses and riders to their limits, Kale leading from the front, with a single-minded focus that left no room for doubt or hesitation. He could feel her, faintly, the pull growing sharper the closer they drew, and he used that feeling as his guide, correcting course whenever the trail grew uncertain. Elena, meanwhile, had not remained passive during the journey east. She had spent the hours of travel studying her guards carefully, noting their patterns, their moments of inattention, the way one of them grew visibly tired as the morning wore on, while the other remained sharply alert. She waited for her moment with the same patience that had carried her through weeks of quiet survival within Blackthorn's walls. That moment came as they paused briefly to water the horses at a narrow stream, the guard's attention divided between the animals and their surroundings. Elena, her wrists still loosely bound, moved quickly, using the edge of a sharp rock near the water to saw through the rope binding her hands, while the guards' backs were turned. She did not run blindly. She had noted, during the journey, the general direction they had traveled, and she understood enough of the local landscape, from stories told within the Blackthorn kitchens, to have some sense of which direction might lead back toward more populated, safer territory. She waited until both guards were fully occupied, then slipped quietly into the tree line, moving as fast and as quietly as her exhaustion allowed. It took the guards several minutes to notice she was gone, precious minutes that gave her enough distance to avoid immediate recapture, though she knew it would not take them long to organize a proper search. She had been moving through the dense trees for perhaps 20 minutes, her heart pounding, her breath ragged, when she heard the unmistakable sound of horses approaching fast from the direction she had come. She froze, uncertain whether this represented the Blackthorn guards who had lost her, or something else entirely. She stepped back further into the shadows of the trees, watching as the riders drew closer, and felt something in her chest loosen with disbelief and overwhelming relief as she recognized, at the front of the approaching party, the unmistakable figure of King Cale Windmore, his eyes already scanning the tree line with an intensity that told her he had felt her presence before he ever saw her. Their eyes met across the distance, and Elena stepped forward from the shadows, no longer running from anyone, finally choosing, of her own will, exactly where she wanted to stand. Before either of them could speak further, the two Blackthorn guards who had lost her burst into the clearing behind her, having finally tracked her trail through the trees, and froze immediately upon seeing the Northern King's full party assembled before them. Their hands moved instinctively toward their weapons, though the sight of Cale's guards, far more numerous and far better positioned, quickly convinced them that any resistance would end badly. "Stand down," Cale said, his voice carrying the absolute authority of a man who expected immediate obedience. "You will explain to your alpha that the girl was found unharmed, and that any further attempt to move her from this territory without my knowledge will be treated as a direct act of hostility against my kingdom." The guards, understanding the position they now found themselves in, lowered their weapons slowly, one of them stammering an attempt at explanation that Cale cut short with a single sharp glance. They were escorted back toward the Blackthorn compound under guard, stripped of any illusion that their actions that morning would go unreported or unpunished. Elena, still catching her breath from the exertion of her escape, found herself studying Cale with a mixture of relief and something closer to wonder. "You came yourself," she said. "You did not send your men ahead while you waited at a safer distance." "I could not have waited," Cale said simply. "Not once I understood what they intended. I have spent too long searching for you to sit idle while you were carried further away." Elena felt the truth of his words settle into her chest, warm and steadying after the fear and exhaustion of the morning's chase. She thought of her uncle's offer to help her disappear entirely, and understood, standing now in this quiet clearing with a king who had ridden through the night rather than risk losing her, that whatever choice she made about her future, she no longer wanted to make it by vanishing from everyone who had begun, in their own imperfect ways, to care what happened to her. "I need to rest," she admitted, the adrenaline of her escape finally beginning to fade, leaving her legs unsteady beneath her. "And I need to think clearly about what comes next, without the fear of being moved again the moment I close my eyes." "You will have both," Cale said. "I give you my word. Whatever happens from here, you will not be moved anywhere again without your own consent." He arranged for a small, secure camp to be set up nearby, away from both the Blackthorn compound and any risk of further pursuit, and Elena finally allowed herself to rest, eating a simple meal provided by Cale's own party and sleeping, for the first time in weeks, without the fear that someone might drag her from her bed before dawn. When she woke, hours later, The sun already well past its peak, she found Cale sitting nearby, keeping quiet watch over the camp, and something in the sight of him there, steady and patient, settled a fear she had not fully realized she was still carrying. "You did not sleep," she observed, noting the tiredness in his expression despite his alert posture. "I did not want to risk missing anything, in case they attempted another move against you," he admitted. "Old habits, built over many years of searching for something I feared I would lose the moment I looked away." Elena studied him for a long moment, understanding, finally, the full weight of what he had carried for so long, and the depth of what it meant, that he had finally found her. "You do not need to guard me so carefully anymore," she said quietly. "I am not going anywhere without deciding it for myself." Cale's expression softened at her words, something like hope settling more fully into place than it had, in longer than he cared to remember. Together, they began discussing what would come next, how best to resolve the situation with Garrick Thorne, once and for all, no longer as a king negotiating from a position of desperate hope, but as two people who had finally found each other, determined now to face whatever remained of this difficult chapter together. Cale was off his horse before it had fully stopped moving, closing the distance between them in a few quick strides, and Elena, exhausted and shaking from the morning's ordeal, found herself standing before him without quite knowing what to say. Up close, the pull she had felt across the great hall days earlier intensified into something almost overwhelming, a sense of rightness, so complete it left little room for words. "You're safe," Cale said, his voice rough with emotions he made no effort to hide. "I felt you moving further away for hours. I feared I would not reach you in time." "I got myself free," Elena said, a flicker of pride breaking through her exhaustion. "I did not simply wait to be rescued." Something like a smile crossed Cale's face, brief, but genuine. "No, I do not imagine you would." The sound of approaching riders interrupted the moment, and both of them turned to see the two Blackthorn guards who had been escorting her arrive at the edge of the clearing, clearly having tracked her trail, and now finding themselves confronted by the Northern King and his full party. They halted immediately, understanding at once the position they now found themselves in. Word of the confrontation reached Garrick Thorne within hours, delivered by a rider who had followed at a distance once the situation became clear. Garrick understood, upon hearing the account, that whatever advantage he had believed himself to hold had just evaporated entirely. Attempting to hide Elena away had backfired completely, transforming what had been a difficult but manageable negotiation into something far more dangerous, an act that could reasonably be interpreted as open aggression against a king who had, until this point, shown considerable restraint. Garrick rode out personally to meet the returning party, arriving at the border of his own territory with a small honor guard, hoping to salvage what remained of the situation through careful diplomacy. "My king," Garrick said, dismounting quickly, his expression carefully arranged into something resembling contrition. "I assure you, the movement of the girl was a misunderstanding, intended only to ensure her safety, while negotiations continued." Cale regarded him with a coldness that made several of Garrick's own guards shift uneasily. "You attempted to hide her from me, Thorne, after I had made clear under the oldest laws recognized by every pack in these territories that she does not belong to you. I have shown considerable patience throughout this process. That patience has now run out entirely." "I am prepared to release her immediately," Garrick said quickly, sensing the shift in power had moved decisively against him. "Without further negotiation, I ask only that we part on terms that do not damage the standing of my pack going forward." "You will release her," Cale said, "and you will do so publicly, before witnesses from both our territories, so there can be no future confusion regarding the terms under which she was held, and the terms under which she is now freed. As for the standing of your pack, that will depend entirely on how honestly you conduct yourself from this point forward." Garrick had little choice but to agree, understanding that any further resistance risked consequences far more severe than the loss of whatever leverage he had hoped to extract. The formal release was arranged for the following day, held in the same great hall where Cale had first laid eyes on Elena across the crowded room. Before the entire assembled household of the Blackthorn pack, along with Cale's full delegation, and Edmund, who had remained nearby exactly as he promised, Garrick formally released Elena from any obligation tied to the original debt, acknowledging before witnesses that she had never rightfully belonged to his pack, once the true nature of her bond had become known. Dorian Vance, standing at the edge of the hall, said nothing throughout the proceedings, understanding that whatever scheme he had hoped to build around Elena's value had collapsed entirely, leaving him with nothing to show for his calculations beyond the quiet, watchful attention of a king who would not soon forget how close his people had come to costing him everything. Mira and Corwin stood together near the back of the hall, both relieved to see the situation resolved without further harm coming to the girl they had each, in their own way, chosen to protect. Elena caught Mira's eye across the room and offered a small, grateful nod, understanding fully now how much she owed the quiet healer's careful courage. When the formal proceedings concluded, Cale turned to Elena, standing beside her now not as a king addressing a servant, but as a man finally standing beside the person fate had chosen for him, across more years of searching than he cared to count. "You are free," he said quietly, for her ears alone. "Free to choose whatever comes next, without obligation to me, to this pack, or to anyone else who has claimed a right to decide your fate, without asking what you actually wanted." Elena looked at him for a long moment, considering the weight of what he was offering her, the freedom to walk away entirely, if that was what she chose. But she thought of the pull she had felt from the very first moment their eyes met, the certainty that had grown steadily since, and she understood that freedom, for her, did not mean walking away from this. It meant choosing it fully, for the first time in her life, entirely on her own terms. "I choose to come with you," she said, "not because fate has decided it, but because I want to." Something in Cale's expression shifted, relief and joy and disbelief, all moving across his face at once, the culmination of decades, spent searching, finally settling into something real and solid before him. They left the Blackthorn compound together that same day, Elena riding beside the king rather than behind him, her uncle Edmund following at a respectful distance, having finally found some measure of peace in seeing her choose her own path forward. The journey north felt different from every journey that had come before it, the landscape passing by not as something to be endured, but as the beginning of a life Elena had never dared to imagine for herself. She thought, as they crossed finally into the northern territories, of the girl who had stood in a cold council hall months earlier, traded away by the people who should have protected her, and she understood how far she had come since then, not through luck alone, but through her own quiet, stubborn refusal to simply accept whatever fate others tried to decide for her. Cale took his full seat upon the throne within days of their return, the ancient laws of his bloodline finally satisfied, standing beside the woman fate had marked for him across more years than either of them had spent apart. The kingdom that had waited so long to see its king truly settled welcomed her without hesitation, understanding, in the way that packs often understand such things instinctively, that she had earned her place beside him through more than mere chance. Elena never forgot the cold stone walls of the pack that had sold her, nor the small, unexpected kindnesses that had helped her survive it. From a healer who risked everything to protect a secret, to a warrior whose conscience would not let him stay silent, to an uncle who arrived too late to prevent her trade but not too late to help see her safely through what followed. She had been sold once, treated as nothing more than a debt to be settled, and she had emerged from that experience not diminished, but transformed, standing finally beside a king who had searched across eternity for exactly the kind of strength she had proven, again and again, that she carried within herself all along. In the months that followed, word of what had happened at the Blackthorn compound spread quietly through the territories, carried by traders and travelers who found the story too remarkable not to share. Some versions grew exaggerated with each retelling, until Elena barely recognized herself in the accounts that reached her second hand, tales of a servant girl who had outwitted an entire pack and won the heart of a king through nothing but her own quiet defiance. She found the exaggerations amusing more than troubling, understanding that stories, once released into the world, rarely remained faithful to the truth of how they actually happened. Garrick Thorns, standing among the neighboring packs, suffered considerably once the full circumstances became known, his attempt to use a fated bond as political leverage, viewed by most as both foolish and dishonorable. He retained his position as alpha, though the respect that had once come more easily to him grew harder to command, and it would be years before the Blackthorn pack fully recovered the trust of its neighbors. Dorian Vance, stripped of the influence he had hoped to gain through his scheming, found his own standing within the pack diminished as well, his ambitions having cost his alpha far more than they had ever promised to deliver. Corwin remained within the Blackthorn pack, though he carried the knowledge of what he had done, warning the Northern King's rider, with a quiet, private pride he shared with no one. He had risked much in choosing conscience over loyalty to his immediate leadership, and though no one within the compound ever fully learned the role he had played, he found a measure of peace in knowing he had done what he believed to be right when it mattered most. Mira received a private message from Elena some months later, delivered by one of Kael's own riders, thanking her for the courage she had shown in protecting a secret that could easily have cost her far more than it did. The healer kept the letter carefully among her herbs and old books, a small, treasured reminder that even in a pack built on hard edges and calculated cruelty, kindness had still found a way to matter. Edmund returned to the Alder pack, changed by what he had witnessed, carrying with him a renewed determination to speak more honestly and act more bravely than he had when his niece's fate was first being decided in that cold council hall. He visited her twice in the years that followed, each time finding her more settled, more confident, more fully herself than the frightened girl who had once stood frozen in front of her own father's quiet betrayal. As for Elena herself, the early months in the Northern Territories brought their own challenges, learning the customs and expectations of a court far grander than anything she had known before, navigating the careful politics of a kingdom that watched its new queen with curious, evaluating eyes. But she carried into that new life the same quiet resilience that had seen her through every hardship since the night she was first traded away, and slowly, steadily, she made a place for herself that was entirely her own, respected not simply because of the bond that had brought her there, but because of everything she had proven herself capable of along the way. Kael, for his part, found in her presence a completeness he had feared he might never know, the hollowness that had followed him through decades of solitary rule, finally giving way to something warmer and far more solid. He ruled now not as a man divided between duty and longing, but as one whose life had finally aligned fully with the throne he occupied, and the kingdom, sensing the change in him, flourished under a leadership that no longer carried the quiet weight of an unfinished search. Years later, when their own children asked how their parents had first found each other, Elena would tell the story simply, without embellishment, describing a cold council hall, a long journey south, and a single moment, in a crowded hall, when everything had changed. She never dwelled on the cruelty of the pack that had sold her, nor the fear of those first difficult weeks, choosing instead to focus on what had come after, the healer, who had risked herself to protect a stranger, the warrior who had chosen conscience over loyalty, and the king who had never once stopped searching, even when hope seemed like the most foolish thing left to hold on to. It was, she would tell them, the truest lesson she had ever learned, that even when the people meant to protect you fail entirely, even when you are treated as nothing more than a debt to be settled, there remains, somewhere in the world, someone willing to search for you across whatever distance separates you, for however long it takes, simply because you are worth finding.